Hi, and welcome to Arts and Entertainment.
With Chris and Randall.
I'm Chris,
I'm Randall.
and welcome to the show. If you're new to the show, or if you're returning to the show, I'm going to ask you the same question, which is please like and subscribe, share, and comment. Randall, if you need to reach us, what's the best way people can reach us?
Well, check out our website. There's various ways to contact us there, chrisandrandall.com. Our Facebook page is pretty popular for leaving comments. You could do that. You could email us.
Yeah, all of those are the best. If you have an idea for a future show, or we did a show and you want to do a follow-up, or you have some other stuff that is related to arts and entertainment, we'd love to share it on the show. So please, it's a conversation we're having. Right now, we're the only ones talking, and you're doing all the listening or watching, which is cool. But if you want to join the conversation with your comments and your thoughts, we would love to hear what you have to say. It's interesting. Ever get a song in your head, Randall? The other day, it was going through my head that the song, I learned it as a child. When the bear went over the mountain, the bear went over the mountain, the bear went over the mountain to see what he could see. You know that one, right?
I'm familiar with that song, yes.
Yeah, it's about a bear, and the bear goes over the mountain to see what he could see. And then it goes further. It just repeats itself to see what he could see, to see what he could see. Now, it dawned on me when hearing that song, I had heard it. It reminded me of another song, which is, for he's a jolly good fellow, for he's a jolly good fellow, for he's a jolly good fellow, and so say we all. Or, and nobody can deny, which then made me go, is it nobody can deny, or so say we all? So I did a bit of research, and for he's a jolly good fellow, originally it was a folk song in early 18th century France. Somehow that song traveled to England in the 19th century, which then became for he's a jolly good fellow and so say we all. And then it traveled to America, which became and nobody can deny. And then somewhere also in the 19th century, a folk song in Germany about a bear going over the mountain ended up using the same orchestration, for lack of a better word. So no one can really explain the phenomenon too well, even though there's a very long Wikipedia entry. But it made me think about how different forms of art copy. In other words, there's a famous quote by, I think it sums it up best, by Pablo Picasso. And Pablo Picasso said, good artists borrow, great artists steal. So today's show is about, I guess, artists stealing artists, for the lack of a better word. The concept known as appropriation. It goes by many other words like collage, combine, but it comes out of the visual art. It's certainly not restricted to the visual arts. What do you think about Picasso's statement? Do you agree that good artists borrow, great artists steal?
Well, we're going to talk about this on the show today, and we are going to. There's so many examples of it. I mean, we're going to go through some of your favorite examples of it, right, Chris?
We're going to go through some of my favorite examples of it. That is actually true. Hey, folks, that's exactly right. We're going to narrow it down to just a few fields of art, such as the visual arts, music, theater, and film. And there's probably other art forms that do this as well, but just for the sake of keeping it concise and timely, that's where our focus is going to lie. Shall we go over to some basic terms? Because I think it's interesting to see it first. This concept of appropriation in art, and that's a visual art theory, it is basically the use of, I'm now reading out of Wikipedia, is the use of pre-existing objects or images with little or no transformation applied to them. And that's an important part, little or no transformation applied to them. The use of appropriation has played a significant role in the history of the arts, literary, visual, musical, and performing arts. In visual arts, to appropriate means to properly adopt, borrow, recycle, or sample aspects or the entire form of human-made visual culture. It's similar to found object art as an artistic strategy with intentional borrowing, copying, alteration of pre-existing images and objects and ideas. It has been defined as taking over into a work of art, of a real object, or even an existing work of art. Now, we have done an episode you may or may not have watched on the Bernie Sanders memes, and while you're watching this, we had just recorded it last week, but you're now watching it several months later. But I find that we're once again back in the concept of how people make their own art, how images can be repurposed and recontextualized. There's a secondary term, which is appropriationism, which is in comparison to appropriation. Appropriation is a 20th century where new representations of established knowledge. But here what you have in appropriationism is, let me get to it because it's such an odd word, remix culture. And remix culture is something that is going on. There's a man named Lawrence Lessig. And Lawrence Lessig, you're a big fan of him, the media scholar.
Yes, Lawrence Lessig. He's a lawyer, and he approaches. He's a lawyer and like a computer nerd, I guess, for lack of a better term, and he approaches art from a legal standpoint. He's investigated the nature of copyright and the purpose of copyright over the years. He's wrapped up in these copyleft movements and these informational freedom movements. Yeah. So. What is it you want to know about Lessig?
Well, Lessig coins this term generation remix in the early part of this century. And he feels that, again, visual arts, music, literature, dance, film, that basically they were here to, what does he say?
Well, can I just say something, Chris, while you look for that quote?
Yeah.
I think prior to the Industrial Revolution, you have an art culture with not much copyright. I mean, copyright's invented somewhere around the printing press to control works roving off the printing press as a form of censorship, actually. But so prior to the Industrial Revolution, you have artists who freely steal and borrow. I mean, Milton Berle is actually a great example of this. He wrote a joke book called the Milton Berle Joke Book. It's got 5,000 jokes in it or something. And he says that he stole every single one of those jokes because he used to work in vaudeville, and in vaudeville, no one. See, we have a totally different concept of stand-up and comedy today, but in vaudeville, everybody just stole each other's jokes and nobody cared. And that's the kind of way art was, I think, prior to the Industrial Revolution. And then now,
and you're absolutely right, because if we go back to the Bear Went Over the Mountain / For He's a Jolly Good Fellow, that's exactly where you're at. No one ever said, "Oh, I'm going to sue the people who made Bear Went Over the Mountain."
Copyright didn't even exist then.
It didn't. It certainly wasn't. It was not. Well, in the 19th century, it exists, but good luck enforcing copyright in that environment was something that came to being in the 18th century by folk artists to begin with. I mean, in that sense, the joke traveling that you refer to has no point of origin, whereas now we're dealing with artworks that has a point of origin. And that's why I want to get to what he says here, which is that on one hand, there are collaborators who foresaw a new age of innovative, useful, entertaining ways for art of the digitalized and globalized 21st century. The new appropriationists will not only realize Joseph, and I cannot pronounce his last name, Bayou's, Beuy's dictum, that everyone is an artist, but also build free societies by liberating art and finally from traditional concepts such as aura, originality, and genius. They will lead to a new term of understanding and defining art. which is what you're saying here. That we're once again going back to liberating art by letting other people use art. Now, the counter argument is that it's derivative, regressive, and it's highly unoriginal. And we can explore that in the show today. But just from what you're saying, I know that you have talked about how everything is really a derivative of everything.
Well, I mean, there's this internet nerd argument that everything is a remix. I tend to agree with it. I mean, what cultural artifact, piece of art is 100% original? They don't exist. Like if you tried to make a 100% original piece of art, you wouldn't be able to do it. There's something you're lifting from other people. There's something you're building on. I mean, that's just the way culture works. And the purpose of copyright is to build these fences around intellectual property so that somebody can own it. And that has the effect of limiting the building blocks of art. It has the effect of retarding culture. I mean, when people, I didn't think about this before, but when people start complaining, that things are too cookie cutter, things are too similar, I mean, maybe part of that is just the law, I mean, maybe part of that is just, the law doesn't allow artistic expression to move forward.
That's a point really let's explore the rest of the show. But let's get out of the realm of theory and let's deal with something practical, especially because what we've been debating has really been out of the visual arts. So one of the earliest movements in appropriation is the Dadaist movement. And for those of you who don't know what Dada is about, it came out after World War I. It was absurdist, subversive, and satirical. One of the most famous Dadaists was a man named Marcel Duchamp, and I can never say his name correctly, but you know that he was known for his ready-mades. Am I right on that one, Randall?
Yes, the ready-mades. He invented the concept of the ready-mades. His idea was he would take an everyday object like a urinal, and he would just put it on a pedestal, sign it, and say, "This is now a piece of fine art."
Exactly. So they were, along with the Cubists, coming out of World War I. They were, and the Surrealists. They had no respect for institutions because at the end they blamed the institutions of the old world for World War I and all the horrors that came from it. So they were political, and they used any of the old representations of the institutions for takedown. Over above my head is a famous example of this. Is that my left, Randall, or your left, the viewer?
It's your left is the Duchamp.
Okay, and on my right is the famous Mona Lisa. And the only difference, for those of you who can't see this, is that the famous painting Mona Lisa is as exactly as it looks in your mind, whereas the Duchamp, which is pretty close, he did a pretty good job. I wouldn't say a forger's job, but a pretty good job of capturing the Mona Lisa, except it's in black and white, which is an interesting choice. It definitely keeps it from being confused, but more subversively, he's put a mustache on the Mona Lisa. And the title of the painting, Duchamp's painting, is LHOOQ, which apparently in French, if you say it fast enough, basically sounds like the equivalent of "there is a fire down below."
I mean, the point he's trying to make is what, Chris, you'd say is he's taking one of the most famous pieces of work, he's adding a small detail, and he's completely transforming it.
And he's knowing that he's pissing people off, which is why there's a fire down below. Like, oh yeah, we got you by the short and tinies. And there is a long history in the visual arts of protest artwork like this. I don't think you can see below me, but there were the Guerrilla Girls, and they took one of my favorite paintings by Odalisque, by Ingres, and they just put a bag over it, and they write, the only way the women can get shown in the Metropolitan Museum of Art is if they're naked. And it really hits that political point so well. So a lot of the times when you see it in the visual art, it can be political or humorous. There's a wonderful Magritte. Is that the one above your head? Yes, above your head, folks, Randall. If you can see above Randall's head, there's the famous. I'm so bad at French. Do you speak French, Randall?
No, I don't.
Okay. So David's portrait of Madame Recamier, 1800, and that is, I guess, on your left. And then there is Magritte's version of that, which is Madame Recamier by David, 1951. And the difference is very clear. The original painting, a woman is reclining on a couch, and 150 years later, it's the same woman, but now in a coffin, an oblong coffin to accommodate the pose that she's reclining on a couch.
Hey, you know, the interesting thing about these works is, or I find one of the interesting things about these works is, if these works had been copyrighted, like if it wasn't the Mona Lisa, if it was like the Disney Snow White, and he tried to draw a mustache on her, I mean, Disney would crack down on his head, right?
Well, actually, no. When we'll get to that in a bit, because you're actually now talking about more of a 20th century thing with Jeff Koons, and Warhol, who would do things of that nature, and we'll get to that literally in a second. Just let me finish up on this, because I think you've raised an excellent question, which is, but I want to hold back on that, if you don't mind. There's other things like Cindy Sherman, who would recreate famous paintings through photography, where she would put herself in it. There is another contemporary 21st century artist from Japan who's often been compared to Cindy Sherman. You want to pronounce his name?
No, go ahead. I have to find it in the text.
Yasumasa Morimura.
That sounds pretty good.
Thank you. And I believe on your side, Randall, for those of you who can see it, there's a very famous painting by Velázquez, and then which Velázquez painted in 1656, and then Morimura repaints it in 2013. But the difference is very stunning, because he takes the painting, but he also shows Velázquez painting it. And he has done various variations of this with characters wandering through the painting and out of the painting to make you aware of the process of painting. And then in doing so, it adds perspective and commentary, which is another way of doing this, in the same way that when you take a famous painting and you transform the scene into photography with Cindy Sherman, it adds the physical dimensions and lighting and perspective. How do you feel, by the way, when you see Cindy Sherman's photos that recreate paintings?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not that taken with a lot of her work. I mean, she did a series where she does photographs that try to look like film stills from movies that were never made, and I actually think that's her best work, and that's the most interesting work she's made.
But how do you feel subject-wise with either her or him on their use of trying to either show you a different art form? Really, that's what's interesting about Sherman for me, is to see how things translate differently from photography, how she's willing to she'll pose as men, she'll pose as old men, she'll pose as young women and old women. There's a plasticity, a mercurialness of it. And I mean, you've seen it in album covers. It's not new to take works of art and juxtapose them in photography. It's just fascinating to me to watch what is a two-dimensional or perspective-based work recreated, just like there is. We have a pageant of masters in Southern California where people come together and they just physically recreate the scenes of great works of art. Have you ever been to it?
Yes, actually, I have. They have a show. Where's it at?
It's in Laguna Beach.
Laguna Beach, the Pageant of Masters, and they have a stage show they do outside in the sun, and it's like an open air theater. And in the show, they just have actors recreate famous paintings on stage.
And it's interesting again because it changes perspective, it adds dimension. So but that's not so much copying as recontextualizing. I think my favorite example of taking one work of art to make another work of art, and I don't have an answer to this math problem, is in 1953, Robert Rauschenberg, a young though not inconsequential artist, asked William de Kooning, famous artist, to participate in an art project. De Kooning, who was not only older and much more established than Rauschenberg, whose work sold for considerable sums of money, agreed to participate and gave Rauschenberg what he considered to be an important drawing, which was executed in heavy crayon, greased pencil, and ink and graphite. Rauschenberg spent a month on this work, and you know what he did with it? He erased it completely. That is what he did. Then he placed the Kooning drawing in gold leaf frame, and in a hand lettered the date and the title on the drawing, and he titled it Erased de Kooning Drawing 1953. Rauschenberg not only had erased de Kooning's work, but he had exhibited the erasure of his work as art. So the question becomes, has Rauschenberg created a work of art, destroyed a work of art, or both? And this is really fascinating to me because this isn't just like a joke. It's not subversion. It's not commentary. It really is using art to make new art, you know? So I don't know. How do you feel about this, Rand?
Well, can I tell some more background about this story? Because I know some. Okay,
do.
So I think I've read de Kooning's account of it. Rauschenberg is a young artist. De Kooning's a very established, successful fine artist. Rauschenberg has this great idea. You know, hardly anybody knows who Rauschenberg is. He goes to de Kooning's house and he says, "My idea is I want to take one of your works, like a drawing, and just erase it and then make that into a piece." And right away, de Kooning thinks it's a great idea. And the main problem they have with this work is they have to find which work of de Kooning's Rauschenberg is going to erase. So they both agree it can't be a minor work. It has to be a significant, substantial work that people actually know about. So that when it's displayed, the art world is like, oh my God, I can't believe he erased that work. And I can't remember what work it is.
Wow.
Right. So they spent a long time. Maybe, I don't remember how, it's been a while since I read the story, but they spent like maybe weeks trying to figure out which work that would be erased. And it had an immediate impact. I mean, it was the art world loved it, of course, or hated it. I don't know. They reacted, which is what art is supposed to make you do, right? It's supposed to make you react.
Art is supposed to make you react. In fact, speaking of erasure, if we were able to erase my setup of this story and just go with your story, it would be awesome. Because to be honest with you, you said it in a much more interesting and fascinating light. If you can't, I understand, and it just proves that sometimes we have to show that we're doing this live.
I remixed your telling, Chris.
I built on your telling. You built on my telling, and you added something to it that changed our perspective and took it out of a flat, two-dimensional understanding, and you added dimension and perspective. Now, this is important to think about. It was made I would argue it's a collaboration, is really what you're telling me. That it's not, the difference between what you've just said and what I just said is, in the first version of that story, de Kooning is just a passive guy. He's just like, yeah, sure, do what you want to do. But when I hear your version of the story, I realize it's an active collaboration, because de Kooning is willingly giving and participating in the transformation of his own work by somebody else. And not, by the way, in the best sense, right? But in the worst sense. He's saying, yeah, here's something wonderful. Here's something representative. You go ahead and destroy it. And your destruction of it, let that be its own art piece. That's insane. And it is really quite literally the counter opposite of stealing art and getting into a copyright lawsuit where someone's like, no, you don't have the right to use my intellectual property. So let's get into the sexiest part of the show, the Copyright Act of 1976. the U.S. Copyright Act of 1976, which provides a defense against copyright infringement when an artist can prove that their use of the underlying work is fair.
Fair use.
Fair use, folks. It has 4 points. Number 1, the purpose and character of the use, commercial or educational, transformative, reproductive, political. The nature of the copyrighted work, fictional or factional, the degree of creativity, the amount and the substantiability of the portion of the original work used, and the effect of the work upon the market or potential market for the original work. And this is where we get into this concept of transformative versus reproductive art. And you were already talking about how copyright has been used. Go explain a little more.
Well, on what subject, Chris? What are you getting at?
Well, one of the things that's the easiest to protect is parody. If you do a parody of anything, it's protected. That's protected by fair use.
Well, I think I'll just say in general, fair use. I think that the 76 copyright law, when it introduces fair use, they're acknowledging that the idea of putting fences around all intellectual property for all time for all these businesses is a little bit ridiculous. You have to give people some way to borrow and sample from other works. I mean, the law explicitly says that right here in fair use. Yeah. I mean, it isn't a protection. It isn't a right. It's actually a legal defense. So like you'll still have to go to court and get sued. So it's not very useful to artists really, but it's there.
It's there, and here's some great examples. We'll pick on Andy Warhol twice. So the first time, Andy Warhol was being sued by a woman named Patricia Caulfield, who was a photographer. Now, Caulfield had taken pictures of flowers of photography for a magazine. And then without her permission, Warhol covered the walls of Castelli's New York Gallery Art with his silkscreen reproductions of her work. Now, after seeing the poster, Caulfield sued Warhol for violating her rights as a copyright owner, and Warhol and her settled out of court. This is something we covered in our Bernie Sanders one when we were talking about the Shepard Fairey photo and how he used a photo from the AP for Obama. So it's pretty clear that is not transformative. That is reproductive. It's just a simple lifting of a photo, and it's a work of art that's particular. Now, compare that with the following. So Warhol, we all know him for the soup cans, right? And believe it or not, Campbell Soup was not excitedly happy about this, but there wasn't much they could do because according to the court, they ruled that the public was unlikely to see the painting as sponsored by the soup company or representing a competing product. Paintings and soup cans are not themselves competing products, according to trademark lawyer Jerome Gilson.
Yeah,
so that's what's called transformative. It has taken the soup can and transformed it into art, even though, if we're being honest, they had to have hired an actual commercial artist to come up with the commercial design for the Campbell soup can. Now, you and I, a couple of years ago, were in a small gallery in Santa Monica where a guy who had met, there was a guy back in the 70s who had ran into Andy Warhol right across the street from the gallery. And he was a big Warhol fan. So what Warhol did was, instead of just giving him his autograph, they walked into a local mini mart.
Yeah, this guy, it's just some guy, right?
Just a normal guy, right?
He sees Andy Warhol and he runs into the grocery store.
So he runs into the grocery store. He buys 2 cans of whatever random Campbell soup cans there are. And he gets Warhol to sign them. And we went there and we saw on display 2 Campbell soup cans with Warhol's autograph on them, valued approximately at $14,000 some 40 years later. And now I've seen a lot of the great Campbell soup cans works at various museums throughout the United States. And you've seen, I'm sure, have you seen the Campbell soup can work either in person?
Yes, I have.
Now, when you look at those paintings, they look transformative, don't they?
Yes.
They're amazing.
There's
When
all
you
sorts of
look-
stories about them. Yes, I know a
but
lot
when you
about.
look at the soup cans with his name on it, what the fuck, man? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to curse.
Well,
Deserves it.
I believe it was a part of the story. It was the first time anybody had asked Warhol to do that, and so because of that, Warhol did it. But then he refused to ever do that again, which is why those soup cans were so valuable. One of the reasons.
So actually, it's interesting because thankfully he would never do it again. But no, Picasso did that, right?
Well, there's a story I know about Picasso. Picasso went out to dinner at some fancy restaurant, and this is when he was a famous artist, and he would pull this kind of thing all the time, actually. But I read this story that I think is true because it was relayed by somebody at the restaurant. So Picasso eats at this fancy restaurant, and after he's done, they send him the bill, and he just takes a napkin, a paper napkin, and he draws like a picture on it, signs it, and then leaves that on the bill and walks out the door. And they just let him do that because it's Picasso, right?
So his signature becomes a work of art. Now, another good example of this really comes from the world of music. There's a song from the early 60s, mid-60s by the Chiffons called He's So Fine. You can look it up, but it goes, he's so fine, do-rang, do-rang. And about a decade later, when George Harrison has just left the Beatles and he puts out his first album, he has a hit song called My Sweet Lord. And people start to notice there's a stunning similarity between the music to My Sweet Lord, and it ends up in court. And it takes a couple of years. Now, Harrison says that he never intentionally meant to take the song. He said he would have gladly changed a few bars, changed the arrangement, modified it, right? There's a certain amount that you can sample from music, but do you remember how that law works?
If I remember right, the courts, I think, have decided that every fourth note has to be a different note. I mean, and I think that really goes to show that when it comes to music, there's like a basic acknowledgement that everybody's going to remix and steal and borrow.
Well,
I mean, that's just how art works.
Too, because there was a guy who had been the Beatles manager, I think his name was Arnold Klein, or could have been Andy Klein. Anyway, he was a terrible man and was often considered responsible for the mismanagement of the Beatles' copyrights, their works. He was fired by the Beatles shortly around the time before they broke up. He ends up buying the rights to the Chiffons' He's So Fine for $576,000 in 1976. So that he can be part of this lawsuit to basically stick it to George Harrison. And the judge literally awards Klein the exact sum of money he paid for the song and no more than that, which is really interesting because that's when John Lennon said, music is everybody's business. It's only the publishers who think they own it. And this is kind of neat because on one hand, when you think about it, that I like where he's going. And then, there's Tom Petty, who seems to just be living that lifestyle, right? I mean, if you're the late Tom Petty, there's a song by the Strokes, one of their earliest songs. It was called Last Night. And they went on TV and they admitted out loud they lifted the music from American Girl. And when the Rolling Stone asked Tom Petty about it, he said, "Oh, that made me laugh out loud." I was like, okay. Good for you. It doesn't bother me. 4 years later, the Red Hot Chili Peppers put out a song called Dani, California, which pretty much instrumentally Mary Jane's Last Dance. And again, Petty just said, look, I seriously doubt there's any negative intent here. A lot of rock and roll sound alike. When asked if he considered a lawsuit, Petty said, I don't believe in lawsuits much. I think there are enough frivolous lawsuits in this country without people fighting over songs. So that's Petty in 2006. 9 years later, Tom Petty and Sam Smith settle out of court because Sam Smith's Stay With Me bears an awful lot of similarities to the Tom Petty Jeff Lynne song Won't Back Down. So even Petty, over a period about a decade or so, goes from being, yeah, all artists are good, to like the Monet.
Well, I'm sure there's a story there, but I don't know what it is. I'm sure something
Well,
happened.
the story is, and this is interesting too, because the story is, if we go back to Rauschenberg and to Kooning, there was cooperation. And when you look at what happens with Tom Petty, I guess I'm going to interpret. There's no reason to say it to be true, but I think Tom Petty just got tired of people appropriating his arrangements for their pop hits, and he just said, "No, you have to pay me. It's only fair." We always tend to think of songs by the lyrics, but arrangements and orchestrations are as much a part of making a song as the lyrics. And I honestly feel like on some level that is fair. But then look at how many pop songs borrow from classical music that's in the public domain, right? And public domain is the like, I'm a big fan of A Whiter Shade of Pale. You know that song?
I love that song. Yeah.
Right.
Good taste,
well,
Chris.
Yeah, thank you. It lifts liberally from Bach's Air on a G string. And it's not like Johannes Bach can come back and say, "Excuse me." In fact, who also borrows from Bach is Lady Gaga's Bad Romance, lifts from Bach's Well-Tempered Cavalier. Now, there's a number of other classical music. There's Pachelbel's Canon in D, which you go Google it and you'll see there's literally like 20 to 30 songs in the last 60 years of pop music that have lifted from that arrangement. And my question to you is, do you think that these artists, are just picking on these people who are long dead who can't sue them? Or do you think that because classical music is one form and pop music is another form, that when you move classical music into a rock song or into a rap song or into a pop song, something happens that changes the music?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, it's like they're on both counts. They know that they're taking something good from another distant genre and putting it into their genre, and they're transforming it, making it something even better, maybe, and or just as good. Let's not get carried away, I guess. I don't know, but
well, but I mean, I guess, yeah.
But they're also protected because it's in the public domain. They have that prior art. They're protected from any kind of lawsuit from anybody.
Yeah, and look, I think Bach is genius. I love Prokofiev and I love Lady Gaga. I don't think they're genius in the way that Bach is genius, but I think they have great insight. You know what I'm saying? The same with Sting using Prokofiev. I think that they have an understanding of they know this is something that goes back to what you just said earlier, which is that you can't make art unless you know about art. You need to know what came before you. You need to know what the forms are. And I think if you look at a person like Sting or Gary Bucker or Lady Gaga, these are all people who have good educations in music theory, in composition. They understand the larger perspective that they're working out of. Same with the visual artists we've just mentioned as well. So their desire to borrow or steal from those works that come behind, isn't that in a way you could argue an expansion?
Well, they're building on what came before, right? I mean, there's this popular mythology of artists and art that a great artist is born and they have some kind of inherent secret knowledge that they spread to the world, and and they never steal because they're like some kind of super genius. And
but
so they're always young, right? So like there's a great mythology. I mean, one of the greatest artists to fit this mythology is Basquiat.
Yeah.
But Basquiat, he had a wonderful art education from his mother, who took him to all the great art galleries in New York when he was a kid. So he broke when he was young, but he was well trained,
right,
well acquainted with what came before.
The point I'm trying to move with, but Basquiat certainly is fine with this, even though we're really talking about music in a sense, is that there's a language, there is an aesthetic language. Things are invented, or attributed. The use of counterpoint, a particular oration, just a simple way that notes are arranged. That to just leave them be as they were and to do nothing with them is almost to consign them to death. So this is all leading to what I think is one of the most interesting examples of remix culture and 21st century answer to this idea of musing music, which is the Gray Album. Now, to be fair, the Gray Album is as follows. I'm just going to go by the guy's name. He calls himself Danger Mouse. And back in 2004, he came up with a soundscape, is I think the way to look at it, or a remix, or he took Jay-Z's The Black Album and the Beatles' The White Album. And these albums in their own right deal with soundscape, collage, sampling, both of them sampled. It's interesting to think that one of the earliest examples of sampling is Revolution Number 9 on the White Album, but they're already sonic mollages. And I like what Mouse says here. He says, a lot of people just assume I took some Beatles and, threw some Jay-Z on top of it, or mixed it up or looped it around, but it's really a deconstruction. It's not an easy thing to do. I was obsessed with the whole project. That's all I was trying to do. See if I could do this. But once I got into it, I didn't think about anything but finishing it. I stuck to those two because I thought it would be more challenging and more fun and more of a statement to what you could do with sample alone. It's an art form. It's a music. You can do different things. It doesn't have to just be what some people call stealing. It can be a lot more than that. So he is literally making new music out of music. And he's not, at the time, it was never supposed to be anything more than for his own edification. It ends up on the internet and it takes a life of its own. And there's even a video that the Swiss directing team of Roman and Pedro do where they lift black and white video mixes from Beatles films and footage from a Jay-Z concert to do variations of what he's doing visually, making it look like John Lennon is breakdancing and Ringo Starr is scratching. Again, not for commercial release, but EMI, who has the publishing rights to the Beatles, they went after this young poor fella living in New York City as if he was like, king of Napster. And it's fascinating to me because both Paul McCartney and Jay-Z were like, this is amazing.
Hey, could I say something about this whole conversation, especially with music, reminds me of something R. Crumb, the cartoonist, wrote many years ago that I've thought about over the years. He's a big fan of old jazz records, of old folk music records, like from the beginning of recording to around the 20s or 30s. And he wrote one time that in one of the books I've read of his that he thinks the 20s and 30s and those old folk records were like the end of real art in music because let me finish because for centuries, for thousands of years, human beings have been making music on their own, folk music, right? Just making like without any commercial ideas in their head. They just played music to have fun. They liberally stole and borrowed from each other. I'm not sure if Crumb said that part, but Crumb's point was that so when the recording industry takes off in the 20s, the recording industry takes off, and by the 20s and 30s, they had started recording all those, all the people, all the folk musicians, all the, I guess indigenous is the best word to use, maybe. I don't know. All the people that were just playing music for pleasure, who are at the end of a thousands-year-old tradition of human history, and they commercialized it, and they built fences around the music. And after that, in Crumb's opinion, there was no more art in music.
Well, it's interesting to think because I would love to know what Crumb would have thought what happens next, because it takes on a life of its own, the Gray Album. And, regardless of all of that, the internet, which seems to now be literally its own people's platform more than ever, the internet responds. They do this thing where it's called Gray Tuesday, where there's massive downloads of this, and it's so much so that nobody can really go after them. And there's a great quote on the aftermath of this by Jonathan Zittrain, professor of internet law at Harvard Law School. And he says, as a matter of pure legal doctrine, the Gray Tuesday protest is breaking the law. End of story. But copyright law was written with a particular form of industry in mind. The flourishing of information technology gives amateurs and home recording artists powerful tools to build and share interesting, transformative, and socially valuable art drawn from pieces of pop culture. There's no place to plug such an important cultural sea change into the current legal regime. So yeah, I mean, look, did I ask for these? Did I get permission to use the paintings that are behind us? Hell no, I just grabbed it. You know? Anybody
That wasn't a good idea, Chris. That wasn't a good idea on our part.
No, it was a terrible idea. I mean, you know, we might get a cease and desist, but you know, look, if you made a Bernie meme, you probably did the same thing, and you could, well, I'm protected by parody. I do think whether it's music or the visual arts, the genie's out of the bottle. You know, Crumb would be very happy, I would hope, that we've reclaimed. You know, remix culture has won, in my opinion. Things like and making a new art out of it. You know what I'm saying? To me, I think the Gray album is very similar to the Rauschenberg-de Kooning collaboration. Not that Danger Mouse had permission from either of Jay-Z or the Beatles, though I think I saw Jay-Z and Paul McCartney actually on the Grammys soon thereafter performing a variation of that. In fact, it's interesting because soon after this comes out, the producers, the Beatles decide, Apple Records just collaborates with Cirque du Soleil, and they do a Cirque du Soleil show called Love. And Paul McCartney sits down with Giles Martin, the son of George Martin, and they actually recontextualize and resample Beatles songs to create almost a new version of Beatles songs for the show. So in that sense, you have the artist adapting the arts. You basically have an artist referencing his own art, which is not the same thing as stealing, because you can always argue that an artist has the right to reuse their own work in different forms. But I don't know if he would have been able to have appreciated how he could have done that had he not had the chance to first look at what Danger Mouse did with his work by transposing it with Jay-Z.
Well, it definitely had an influence. I mean, I don't think you're misplaced to say that at all.
So let's bring it down to even something different, but very clear and clean. Let's just look now at theater and film. And I like to lump theater and film together because, and you'll see pretty quickly that the things that I'm talking about have been made into film or incorporate film, but they also incorporate theater. So, and they're all occurring around the same time. In the 1960s is when Warhol is starting to come out. Rauschenberg, Jasper Johns is using comic book. The 60s in general, the pop art movie visually is recontextualizing classic works. And a guy named Tom Stoppard, who's a young playwright in 1966 at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, puts out a play called Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. And if you're familiar with Hamlet, and from here on in, I'm just spoiling a lot of famous works, so go for it. There are two small characters, and the final line of the play is, or one of the last lines of the play is, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead. They die. And what Stoppard wants to do is he wants to look at what was going on in Hamlet, the story, from their perspective. So now Hamlet is the minor character in the play, and the minor characters are the major characters. And you have to be very familiar with Hamlet to know what's going on. And he's using the same people as Shakespeare. He's just creating a new play that actually only works as long as the original work of art works as well. Have you ever seen Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead? There's a film version.
I think I read the script years ago. That's about as far as I've gotten with that.
Yeah, it's very meta. My parents saw it when it came out on Broadway. They loved it, but they knew Hamlet, and I'm sure you've definitely seen Hamlet.
Yeah.
If you haven't seen Hamlet, you're too stupid for this show. No, I'm not going to say that. You're not too stupid.
That's very judgmental of you, Chris.
No, you're not too stupid. I promise. I was just joking. But seriously, folks, read, watch, or see Hamlet, because, it'll really improve your life.
It's pretty good.
But the more interesting work for me comes in 1974, which is this play that he did called Travesties. And Travesties is ostensibly, it takes place in 1917, based on a true story about this man who worked for the British Home Office in Zurich, who stages a production of The Importance of Being Earnest. This really did happen, where he incorporates people who just happened to be living in Zurich at the time, Tristan Tzar, the head of the Dadaist movement, James Joyce, and Nikolai Lenin. And it's being recounted in the present day, the 1970s. He's an old man, and he has the beginnings of dementia, and his memory isn't clear and clean. And he is recounting how he did this, but at the same time, the production of Oscar Wilde's Importance of Being Earnest keeps on filtering into his memory, so that Stoppard is constantly taking characters and names and dialogue and scenes from Oscar Wilde's play and infusing it with his understanding of socialism, Dadaism, and Joyce's aesthetic philosophies. Now, the original work, if you're familiar with it, it's a satiric comedy of manners. Wilde is a contemporary of Shaw. It's still a play of ideas, albeit the 19th century ideas of society, of English society at that time, versus the early 20th century ideas of that Stoppard is writing. But it's very much like sampling. It's very much like the Gray Album. It really shows parallelisms and contrasts. If you've read The Importance of Being Earnest, it's brilliant. I saw it with a friend of mine who hadn't, and he said he enjoyed it, and I believe him. But when you go to see this play, there's literally like an 8-page booklet full of facts about all of the stuff, so you can get the reference points. Years ago off Broadway, there was a theater company that would do 2 nights. One production would be The Importance of Being Earnest, followed by the next night Travesties, because the two, you can certainly enjoy The Importance of Being Earnest without ever having seen Travesties. But I do believe that what Stoppard has done is so much an examination of different ideas through Travesties, that if you have, through Importance of Being Earnest, that if you haven't seen Ernest, I think you get kind of lost. Even more so than if you haven't seen Hamlet. It's tough because I'm talking about something you haven't seen. So let me talk about something you have seen. So let's deal with Woody Allen. His big, you've seen What's Up, Tiger Lily?
Yes, I've seen it.
So, you want to tell them the story about that?
Well, sure. What's Up, Tiger Lily is the movie you can blame for why Woody Allen is the famous Woody Allen today. Woody Allen took a Japanese movie that was relatively mundane, I would say, not that interesting, and he just redubbed it with his own dialogue to turn it into a different movie. I mean, there's a bunch of re-edits, I'm sure, and so, I mean, it was inventive. It was cheap, and I'm not sure which production house put it out, but I think it was a low-budget B-movie production house. I mean, this is 1966, so the theatrical climate at that time is like the Roger Corman type climate. You could put out like low-budget kind of fare, and so Woody Allen found a way to make one of the most ultimate low-budget movies ever, What's Up, Tiger Lily? Well, and I don't think it's a very good movie. I think we both agree on that. It was
originally Allen made a 1-hour TV sketch and that was his version of What's Up, Tiger Lily. The people who had the rights to it decided to add another film and the Lovin' Spoonfuls, who were a pop team of that era, and add music by the Lovin' Spoonfuls and an extra half hour lifted from another film entirely that Alan had no control in the editing or doing of. And then they re-edited even Alan's soundtrack. So it's interesting because in that way, he created the 1 hour version of What Up Tiger Lily. His producers created a second version of it, which is the theatrical version. But yeah, I mean, it's art made out of art. And this one is fascinating to me because, and it's something you do see in the visual arts movement, cutting up film to make your own film. It's collage, as you would say, deconstruction. And I would argue the original source material, which is the International Police series from Japan, it's not that great. It's okay, but is What's Up Tiger Lily that much better? I don't know.
What's Up Tiger Lily is not good. It's just cheap, I think, is what's going on there.
It's amusing at best. But what happens out of this 2 years later is Alan writes a play, and then a year later after that, it's made into a film. And the play in the movie is called Play It Again, Sam. And the basic premise is it takes place in San Francisco. A 30-something film critic who lives in San Francisco has just gone through a bitter divorce. He's single. He's on the dating scene. He has a best friend and a wife, and they kind of are trying to encourage him to get back into it. And his favorite movie is Casablanca. And all of a sudden, Rick Blaine from Casablanca starts appearing in his dreams. And he starts seeing him. No one else can see him, but Rick Blaine becomes his mentor for how to get through life. It's interesting. There's a film that came out about a few years ago called Son of Rambo, which is kind of similar, and I think even where a kid basically finds his influence in watching Rambo movies. So already this is about how, fanaticism, fanism teaches us something. And, this is a hero. And he does end up getting into an affair with his best friend's wife. And at the end, when the husband is leaving on I'm assuming everybody here has seen Casablanca. If you haven't, everything I'm talking about is paralleled in Casablanca. Rick Blaine in Africa it's World War II, and he runs a club, and in his club walks in his ex-lover who's now married to a Czech resistance leader, and they have to sneak him out of the country before the Nazis get him so he can continue to read the Czech resistance. And Rick and Ilsa rekindle their love, but at the last minute, around the end of the film, when her husband is about to get on the plane, Rick gives this beautiful monologue about how she has to get on the plane. So what happens here is the line goes, if that plane leaves the ground and you're not on it, you'll regret it. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon, and for the rest of your life. Now, that same line of dialogue is delivered at the end of Play It Again, Sam, and Linda says, that's beautiful, causing the Alan character to admit, it's from Casablanca. I've waited my whole life to say it. His journey's complete. Bogart praises him, and he doesn't need his advice anymore. And then the music from Casablanca returns, and we end the film as time goes by, which is also how the film Casablanca ends. And the parallelism there is, you've seen the film, right?
Yes, I've seen Casablanca.
And you've seen Play It Again, Sam?
Yes, I've seen it.
I love that film. I just think that's the sweetest ending. How do you feel?
Yeah, it's a great movie. I mean, Woody Allen springboarded off of What's Up Tiger Lily to make a movie that basically just pleased everybody, and it really jump-started his career.
I would have loved to have seen what that would have looked like on stage, because the film does have film clips, whereas I don't think the stage version would have had the film clips. But the idea behind how, and it's not anything like Casablanca. That's the best part. Casablanca is a romantic tragedy, a drama, and this is a relationship movie. And another good example of how you can use a film as artifact that influences a character's growth in another film is Wall-E. I'm sure most of us have seen Wall-E. You've seen Wall-E, right?
Yes, I've seen Wall-E.
Came out in 2008, and the premise behind it is, we're 100 years into the future. Man is living out in the space. The Earth is abandoned, and little Wall-E is left among the rubble of detritus, of all the old stuff that people threw away on the old planet Earth. And Andrew Stanton was interviewed about 2018, and he had always wanted Wall-E to find something among all the junk that showed the art, the potential of what made human beings human beings. And he originally thought of old French film, because we always think of French as culture, but there was an animated French film called The Triplets of Belleville, which lifted the same idea. So he had to come up with something new. And again, at the time, he was listening to Hello, Dolly. He had been in a production of Hello, Dolly in high school, and he had played Barnaby, and the song Put On Your Sunday Clothes was just going through his head. And he turned to his wife, and I said, I think I have the strangest idea I ever had. He says, we were still working on all the details for quite a long time about all the story points, but we could carve these little moments around the song. It was really mining the song and watching the movie for anything that looked memorable and definable. So it was easy to reverse engineer. Tipping your hat is something that really is clear. Let's see if we can come up with some trash that looks like a top hat. So he says, I want to use this song. And it's not a Disney movie, Hello, Dolly, so he had to get rights from Fox. But once he got the rights, he not only added that one, but he also took the song It Only Takes the Moment. And he said, my story required him to teach for Wall-E to learn how to hold hands, because they never do in Hello, Dolly. And they do in Hello, Dolly, sorry. They do it in one brief moment in a wide shot, but he actually cut the wide shot into a close-up. So he actually altered the filmmaker's vision. I honestly forgot who directed Hello, Dolly. I know the choreographer, it was Gene Kelly. Gene Kelly, actually, the great musical theater dancer, directed Hello, Dolly. So they even changed it so that the visual would serve the story of Wall-E. And I think it's interesting too, because it's an animated film, and in an animated film, you have you have two-dimensional visual art reality, whereas here, the movie is three-dimensional human beings. So it's a lovely inversion, because normally it's the picture that's the fantasy, and it's the photograph it's realism, and here it's the actual opposite. Here it's the film that's the fantasy, and the picture that's the reality. How did you feel about it when you saw that in the theater?
Well, Wall-E, it's kind of like a Zen movie at the beginning, it's definitely like a strange experience. I mean, one of the most artistic films Pixar's ever done, and I'm really struck by the idea to put a well-known song into the movie. If you think about it, what if they had decided, oh, we're gonna have to just put in a novel song because we can't get rights for anything, we can't afford it or whatever. It changes the whole tone of the piece, right? I mean, that this little robot is listening to Hello, Dolly, it makes it it humanizes it. There's a cultural cachet with listening to that particular song, because that particular song has certain cultural significance that a novel song wouldn't. So a novel song, you wouldn't be able to create the same feeling, the same feeling in the characters, the same feeling in the audience.
You'd have to write a song, which is a traditional Disney movie choice. Traditionally, Disney would hire a Broadway composer, and there would be singing. But Wall-E actually is interesting in that there is no musical numbers in the world of Wall-E. And by choosing, oh, look, it's not the first time you've ever seen film in an animation. You go back to Warner Brothers, and you can see like Robin Hood, played by Errol Flynn, appearing with Bugs Bunny. But it's the first time that I can remember in a feature-length animated film where they hung a lantern on actual film and contrasted it with animation, and by doing so, constantly reminding you that what you are watching is also that what you're watching is also art. You know, there's nothing that makes you more aware of the fact that what you're watching is art than that. So I like that, and I think it works well, and yet we're still committed to the story. So the last thing I really want to talk about, and one that I really feel, again, it's just a really fascinating way of adding layers and dimension, is Stephen Sondheim and the movie A Marriage Story. The Marriage Story. A Marriage Story? That's what it's
I think
called.
it's A Marriage Story.
A Marriage Story, thank you. Now, that came out in 2019. Strangely enough, that year, there was a flurry of Sondheim songs that started appearing in movies and in TV shows. A Marriage Story, if you haven't seen it, it takes place in the present day. Adam Driver and Scarlett Johansson are a couple. Driver is a New York director who runs a stage director who runs his own off-Broadway theater company, and his wife, played by Scarlett Johansson, was a Hollywood actress who gave up her career to do off-Broadway theater with him. They have a son, and by the end of the movie, they have gone through a long and drawn-out divorce proceeding, and now she is living with his son in Los Angeles, and he is now living by himself, still producing plays in New York City. There's a musical that came out in 1970 by Stephen Sondheim called Company. And Company is about a guy named Bobby who is turning 35, and he has a lot of friends and he dates a lot of women, but he's really detached and he doesn't really know how to make meaningful emotional connections romantically, and his friends worry about him and his girlfriends complain about him. And Birnbach and Driver were big fans of the play and would often sing the song Being Alive, which is a song that ends Company, where Bobby is really kind of coming to his cathartic moment of understanding what it's like to be a human being and the necessity of feeling heartache in order to move on and be a human. And they were just singing it all the time. In this quote, Baumbach was saying, Being Alive came on very early in the process. We got together and we started to play around with him singing it and rehearsing, Baumbach said. It was actually a couple of months before we started to do it, and we thought he would know so well that he could remember all the lines. Baumbach cited a lot of reasons for choosing the Sondheim song, Being Alive, specifically for his movie about divorce, Driver's bigness, his superiority of coast over the other. The composer represents a version of a New York he felt familiar to Baumbach, so it felt tonally to include the New York I grew up knowing. He said, plot-wise, the song selection works too. The piano bar scenes echo an earlier monologue from Scarlett Johansson about lacking aliveness in her marriage, and comes just after she, Julie Haggerty, and Merritt Weaver sing You Could Drive a Person Crazy at a Party, which is also from Company. Now, Google this later, but when Driver doesn't just singing the song, he literally sings the lines of dialogue that come before the song and intersperse into the song. And while his character's older and has been married, so much of the journey that Driver has been on parallels so much of the journey that Bobby goes on. Now, at the beginning of the song, he's just showing off to his friends that he knows the song so well that he can quote dialogue. And these are theater people, so naturally they know the song line by line too. But as he goes further and further into the song, he finds himself having his breakdown, his crisis, where he really loses himself. And the feelings of the character and the understanding of what he has gone through all occur in the singing of the song. Now, you could argue, well, I guess Sondheim basically is getting ripped off here. Certainly, Sondheim had to give his permission for the use of this song, as he did for any of those. But Sondheim was fine with this because, again, going back to Rauschenberg and de Kooning, in one sense, this is an erasure of the reason behind why those lyrics were written, because originally it was written for a character named Bobby who was turning 35, and after having had his heart broken, realizes that's just part of being alive, and having instead transposed upon it this story that Birnbach writes. But I honestly believe the reason why Driver was nominated that year for Best Actor in a Film has a lot to do with how much his character finally loses his composure, and he's been angry and savage for most of the film. But there's such an understanding and vulnerability in that brief scene. I know he literally walked out of an interview when they played it. And I think, again, kind of like the Gray Album, kind of like some of the better works, it gets past commentary or ironic juxtaposition. And I think it finds a truth that was always inherent in the original work, and it finds the objective correlative, that which makes the truth not only true in the context of the Sondheim musical, but also objectively true in the story of a marriage story. I don't know if that's as true when they do You Could Drive a Person Crazy. That feels more like ironic commentary, but I do believe when you watch that scene, I think for a lot of people who watch that scene, they've never seen Company. Go and watch Company on YouTube. It's great.
Well, do you think this movie would have worked as well if all the music was like novel and original for the movie? I mean, don't you think that choosing these songs gives it a certain cultural cachet?
Well, I think it might have worked depending on who the composer was. It might have worked brilliantly if the song was great. All I can say is there's something in the Beatles, there's something in Jay-Z, there's something in Shakespeare, there's something in Wilde, and there's something in all of these artists that when you switch, that if you can find a way of translating it into another art media, into another art form. Now, true, we've picked on musicals quite a bit between Wall-E and this one, but there's something in music that's always poetic and transportive, and cinema is more visually transportive. So by taking a musical song, it adds an oral dimension to it.
Yeah, I'm reminded of this story. The original composer in 2001 wrote this story like years ago. He was contracted, to do the score of 2001. He was going to write all the symphonic music. They were going to score it the way they score old Hollywood movies. They were going to get a symphony and play it, and usually in the editing process, you just shove like recorded music in there that's pre-existing to just hold the place. It's called temp music or temporary music. And so this composer was supposed to, he had seen a cut with the temporary music, and he was supposed to go in and, write music for everything, and it was going to be replaced. But then he wrote it and recorded it apparently, but then he went to a screening, one of the early screenings for it, and Kubrick hadn't used any of his music. He just used the temp music. And then I think later on in an interview, Kubrick said, why would I use music written by some Hollywood composer that's just going to be like not as good as the old music? It's just going to be derivative of the older music anyway. So why don't I just use the original music?
You see that again in Breaking Away by Peter Yates. He uses Vivaldi. Alan Alda's Four Seasons is quite literally an incorporation of all of those Vivaldi songs. Yeah, I think so. You said this at the start of the show, and I think it's worth revisiting again as we end the show. Do you feel like art is derivative of all art? That this idea that everything kind of borrows from everything else?
Well, it's definitely an idea I've resisted for years, but I don't know. I don't think there's any way around it. It just seems like, if you're going to build a house, you need a brick.
Well, I think you and I both agree that it can be unoriginal, but it can also be brilliant. And I guess technically, derivative is boring, innovative is brilliant. And I guess my answer to the question is, I guess good artists borrow, great artists steal. Well, I'll forgive a great artist for stealing, but anything less, I won't. All right, well, till then, I'm Chris.
I'm Randall.
Thanks for watching and listening. Goodbye.